Hi, it's Sal here. In this short crash course, I'm going to go over my complete workflow for creating custom 3D characters that I use in my animations and visualizers. I would recommend learning the basics of Blender before starting this course, as some of the steps may be a bit challenging if you're not familiar with Blender. Here are the list of things we'll be covering: how we can use images to create custom face morph using FaceGen, applying our face morph to a Daz character, importing our custom characters into Blender, adding a pose or animation to our character, adding different hairstyles and facial hair, using Marvelous Designer to create clothing for our character, and finally creating a simple scene and then rendering our animation. Now you can also download my models off my website. They're fully rigged, so you'll be able to pose them or animate them however you want. And with that out of the way, let's get started. So first we'll need to download Daz Studio. To do this, we can go to the Daz website. Here it'll prompt us to make an account, and once that's done, we can press the download Daz Studio button. This should automatically start the download. And once the download is done, we can go ahead and finish the installation process. Now what we actually downloaded is the Daz Install Manager, which will allow us to download Daz Studio and other packages that we may need. So once we open that, it will once again ask us to log in with the account we just made. And here it will show you all the packages you can download. You want to just leave it at the default setting where it will have everything selected, and you want to go ahead and click the Start Queue button. Now this is going to take some time because it has to download all the packages one by one. But once it's done, we should have Daz Studio installed on our computer. Now let's go ahead and quickly open it just to make sure that everything works fine before we move on to FaceGen. And here it's going to ask us to log in once again. And once we're logged in, we can go ahead and click on the figures drop down and quickly check to make sure we have the Genesis 8 model. Now if we double click on the model, it'll open one up in the project for us. This is where we're going to be using with FaceGen. Now we'll come back to Daz Studio and go over this software in more detail once we're done with the steps in FaceGen. So we'll go to our browser and search for FaceGen. And once we're on the FaceGen website, we can click on the Products tab and then select the FaceGen Artist option. Here we're going to be purchasing the Pro option. Now I already have the software installed, so I'm not going to download it again. But feel free to pause the video here and then join me once you're done. Now when you open up FaceGen, you'll have something that looks like this. To create realistic faces using FaceGen, all we need are two decent quality images, one taken from the front and one taken from the side. The main things we need to worry about is first making sure that our character has a neutral facial expression in both photos. Second, we need to make sure that the lighting is decent as well. And lastly, the other big factor is the resolution of the images itself. Low-res images will result in blurry textures. This is because FaceGen uses these images to not only create the 3D geometry, but the texture for a character as well. So the higher the quality of the image is, the more accurate the overall results will be. For this project, I'll be creating a 3D model of Kanye. Now I can go on Google and search for Kanye West front, and I can already see a couple of images that would work really well here. Now I can also search for a side profile photo, and then download one that I think will work well. Now once I have these downloaded, I like to place them in my project directory. Now in FaceGen we can go ahead and upload the front image. Depending on the version of FaceGen you have, it might automatically place the markers on the face for you, but you will most likely still have to adjust them a little bit. To know where to place the markers, you can reference the image at the top here. The closer you can get the markers in the right spot, the more accurate the final results will be. To move the markers, we can left click on them, and then drag them to a point on the face. Once I'm happy with how all the markers look, I can press the done button at the bottom. Now we can go ahead and upload the side profile image as well, which in my case I only have the left side, so that's the one I'll be uploading. And once again it tried to place all the markers for us automatically, but in this case it really didn't get it right at all, so I'll have to manually fix them. To do this I can hold the right mouse button, which will move all the markers at the same time. Then I can manually fix each marker one by one. And once again I can reference the image at the top here to make sure I have all the points at the right spot. Once we're done with both images, we're pretty much ready to create our face morph. Here I just want to make sure that both of these options are checked. I tend to get the best results with this. And this also really helps when both your front and side images have different lighting, which is the case for me. And once we're ready, we can click the Create from Photos button. And finally we have our face morph ready. And this is what we're going to be using in Daz Studio. Now if you have a face morph that looks a little too distorted, you can always try again with different photos. It's a bit of a trial and error process until you get the right looking face morph. Just a quick note, you can always edit the face morph later on in Blender as well, using the sculpting tools. Now heading into the File tab, we can give our face geometry a parameter name. This is the name it will be referenced by in Daz Studio. Here we also want to make sure that the Genesis 8 model is selected, and then we can make sure we have the right gender selected for our character as well. And once we have that, we can scroll down and click on the export button at the bottom. Now this is going to take some time to generate our face morph and our textures for us. And then it will also give us a directory for where our face morph and our textures are saved. Now it's really important to keep in mind where the textures are saved because we'll be referencing this later on in Daz Studio. Now let's go ahead and open up Daz Studio. And once it's open, we can go into the figures dropdown and search for our Genesis 8 model once again. Now to move around in Daz Studio, you can orbit using the orbit button in the top right. And you can pan around as well using the pan button underneath. Here we just want to make sure that we have our Genesis 8 mil selected. And then we'll go into the shaping tab and then go into head and look for the parameter name that we saved our face morph with. Now here if I zoom in on my character and then move the slider, you can see that our face changes into our face morph. Now obviously it still doesn't look like our character, and that's because we still haven't applied the texture maps yet. So to do that we can go into the surfaces tab here, and then click on Genesis 8 mil, and if you go to this drop down, we can see the surfaces. Now for each surface, we're going to need to add in the texture maps that were generated by FaceGen, and these are going to be saved in that directory that I mentioned earlier. Now we can start off by changing the face texture. So if we click on the face drop down here, we'll want to change the base color. And if we click on the browse option, it will open up the file browser for us. And here we want to go into that directory where all the texture maps were saved by FaceGen. We can do that by going to textures, and then select FaceGen, and then here we want to select the Genesis 8 mil. And then we'll find the folder for our character. So we want to click on that and this should open up all our textures for us. Now here's a good idea to copy this directory to our clipboard, so we can easily paste this when we're changing all of our other surfaces as well. So now we can apply the face texture map for the face of our character. For the arms, we can apply the arms texture map. For the ears, we'll be using the face texture map once again. For the eye socket, here we'll use the face texture map. Fingernail uses the same texture maps as the arms. For the legs, we'll use the legs texture map. For the lips, it's going to be the face one once again. For the mouth and teeth, we can skip those ones because FaceGen doesn't generate a texture map for those. So we'll just go with the default one that's already there. For the toenails, that's going to be the legs one once again. And finally for the torso, we'll use the torso texture map. So now we have all the texture maps applied except for the ones for the eyes. And the reason I didn't apply the eye ones is because the ones generated by FaceGen don't always look very good. So I tend to use the default ones from Daz or use my own that I created in Photoshop. And now we can go ahead and add this texture map to all the eye surfaces. Now next let's change the body shape. To do this we can go back to the shaping tab, but this time go into the actor dropdown. And here we can see a list of parameters that we can play around with until we get the body shape to match our character. Now we need to export our character into Blender. Now this isn't as straightforward as you would think. Here we have a couple options, but I find that the best option is to use the diffeomorphic plugin. Now I already have the plugin installed, so I'm not going to go through the process of installing it again. But there's a great YouTube video that you can watch that covers the full process of installing the diffeomorphic plugin. Now once we have the diffeomorphic plugin installed, the first thing we want to do is save our project. So we can go into File and then select the Save As button and then pick a directory where we want to save our project. Now we can finally export our character. So with the diffeomorphic plugin, you should have this export to Blender option here. So you want to select that and then save your file with the same name in the same directory where you saved your project. And now we have exported our character and we can import it into Blender. So let's open up a new Blender scene. And let's start off by deleting everything in our scene. Now if you install the diffeomorphic plugin correctly, you should have this Daz importer tab here. And this is what we're going to be using to import our character. First, we want to make sure that we have the correct global settings. In the load root paths, we need to make sure we have the correct JSON file selected. This is the one you would have downloaded with the diffeomorphic plugin earlier. Now let's go over how we can import our character. So we have the import Daz and the easy import Daz options. They both serve slightly different purposes, but for now let's use the import Daz option. Now let's head to our directory where we saved our project, and then we want to import the DUF file. And with that, our character is now finally imported into our scene. Now I want to quickly show you what our character actually looks like in render view. So let's set our viewport shading to rendered. Now because our scene has no lighting in it, we can't really see anything, but we can quickly fix that by going to the world property settings and then changing the color to white. Now we see our character a lot more clearly, but this still isn't how we're going to see it when we render it. And that's because by default we're in the EV render engine. And we want to change that to cycles, so let's head to the render property settings, and then let's change the render engine from EV to cycles. Now I'm also going to change my device to GPU since I have a GPU in my computer. And lastly, I want to change the max samples to 16 for both the viewport and the render settings. This is just for testing purposes, so if I want to do a quick render, it doesn't take as long. But with that, now we get a pretty good idea of what our character is going to look like when we're rendering it. Now in a lot of cases, your character's face may not perfectly match what it looks like in real life. In these situations, I like to use sculpting tools to further refine the geometry of the face. So first let's hide our rig. And then let's head into sculpting mode. Here we have a ton of brushes we can use to sculpt our geometry. Now for me, I only really use 3 brushes. The draw brush, the grab brush, and the smooth brush. And I also like to make sure that the mirroring option is turned on the x-axis, so it applies the changes to both sides of the face. Now we can also adjust the size of our brush by pressing F and then moving our cursor to adjust the size. And then from here we can start to use our brushes to make subtle changes to the face until it starts to look a bit more accurate. And with that, I'm pretty happy with the changes. Now additionally, we can also make changes to the face texture as well. Now in a lot of cases, you might have blurry areas or light spots that you might want to fix. Now this isn't super visible in most of the renders you'll be doing, but if you're taking any close-up shots, then you might want to consider it. So we can go to the directory where our texture maps are saved. Here it's the face texture map that you'll want to edit in either Photoshop or any other editing software of your choice. I like to use Procreate on my iPad, so I'm going to send this file to my iPad and make my changes there. Now I have the face texture map open on my Procreate app on my iPad. Here I'm going to mainly use the smudge tool to clean up all the blurry areas. Now I spent a couple of minutes here cleaning up the texture map as best as I could. And you can also use this exact workflow to add tattoos to your character as well. Although it is sometimes a bit tricky because of the way that the texture map is stretched. So Substance Painter may be the better option there. But nonetheless, you could still use this method for adding tattoos as well. And once I was done, I saved this new texture map in my textures directory. Now to apply this new texture map, we can head to the shading editor. And here with our face material selected, we can change the file of the first node to our new texture map. And now we can see our updated texture map on our character. And I think this looks a lot cleaner. Also a quick note, I added this section of the course all the way at the end, once I was already done recording everything else. So for the remainder of the course, I'll still be using the old texture map. Now next let's go over how we can add animations to our characters. Now there are many approaches here. The simplest and most cost-effective approach is to use Mixamo. So let's go over that first. Mixamo is an animation library with a ton of pre-made animations that we can use. And for this we'll need to import our character. Now before I export my character, I want to first go into the modifier tab and then delete the subdivision modifier. The reason for this is to reduce the poly count, and this just makes it a lot faster to import the model into Mixamo. And now we can export our character as an FBX. And here you want to make sure you have the selected objects option checked. And once we're inside Mixamo, we can click the upload character button, and now here we want to select the FBX file that we just exported. And once our character is uploaded, Mixamo is going to ask us to add some points to different parts of the body. And here you want to take your time just to make sure that everything is accurate. This is going to affect how your animation turns out in the end. And once we're done, we can click the next button, and then Mixamo is going to take some time to rig our character. And once that's done, we should have our character rigged. Now from here we can add in any animation that we want. So in the search bar, you can search for any animation. In my case, I'm going to search for a walk animation and then pick one that I like. And now we can see the animation applied to our character. Now pretty much for all the animations, I always like to have the in place option checked. And then I can play around with the other parameters as well until the animation looks the way I want. Now from here we can click the download button, and here you just want to make sure you have the exact same settings as me. Now in our Blender scene, we can import this FBX file. And I'm just going to move it up so it's not overlapping with our old character. Now if we go into render view, we'll notice that the textures look a bit off. And that's because when we export our character as an FBX, we lose the texture data that is applied in Blender. And I can show you this by going to the shading editor. Now this is what our texture nodes look like for our newly added character. And if we compare this to the texture nodes applied to our old character, you'll notice that there's a huge difference. So we want to essentially add the same texture maps to this new character as the old one. And there's an easy way to do this. So if we select our newly added character and then shift select our old character, we can press Ctrl L and this will open up the link menu. And here we want to select materials. Now this will apply the same materials from our old character to our new character. Now we can get rid of the old character, and then let's also move our new character back to the origin point. Now our animation is only 45 frames, and I want to extend that. So I'm going to copy all of my keyframes and then paste them over and over again. And this should still give me a smooth walking animation all the way till the end. Now next I want to select all the keyframes and then move them up by 25 frames. And I'll explain why I do that in a second here. Now with the rig selected, we want to go into pose mode. And here with all our bones selected, we first want to go to the first frame and then go to the pose drop down and select clear transform. And this will give us our character back in A pose. Now we can press I and then select the location rotation option. This will add a keyframe for us on the first frame. Now the reason we did this is because it's a lot easier to work on our character in A pose. So I like to have that as a static pose on the first frame. And the reason why we have a 25 frame gap in between is because this will give us a smooth transition from our A pose to our walk animation. And this is really important when we add in the clothing and simulate it with an animation. So I'll explain it when we get to that point. Now this was the most basic way of adding an animation to our character. And I'm not really a huge fan of this method because of how many steps there are. So I'm going to show you a plugin that I use that really helps speed up the workflow. And it's called the RigGNS plugin. So I'm going to open up a new scene and then redo this whole process using the RigGNS plugin. Now to download this plugin, you can search for RigGNS on Google. Now I already have it installed, so I'm not going to go through the process again. But it's pretty much the same process as installing any other plugin in Blender. Now in a new Blender project, I'm going to import my Daz character once again, using the same process as before. And now we have our character back in our scene. And the first step I need to take before we add the RigGNS rig is to unparent our eyelashes from the current rig. Now we can do this by pressing Alt-P and then selecting the clear parent option. And now our eyelashes are no longer attached to our current rig. And the reason we do this is because when we add the RigGNS rig, it gets rid of the eyelashes. So we have to get rid of them and then add the RigGNS rig first, and then we can parent the eyelashes to that rig after. So now to add the RigGNS rig, we want to first select our rig in the outliner. Then in the RigGNS tab, we can go into the rig figure dropdown and then go through the steps of converting our rig to the GNS rig. Now this is pretty much the same thing as the meta rig in Blender. And now in pose mode, this rig gives us the ability to pretty much pose any bone in the body. And this is much better than the Mixamo rig because we get face bones with this rig as well. Now let's go back into object mode and then select our eyelashes. Now we can parent them back to the rig by selecting eyelashes and then selecting our rig, and then pressing Ctrl P and selecting the automatic weights option. And now our eyelashes should be parented to our rig. Now to add an animation to our GNS rig, we need to use Mixamo once again. But the process is a lot simpler because we can directly add an animation to our character. So let's head back into Mixamo. And then here we want to first change our character to the X-Bot. And that's because there's a bug with RigGNS where if it's not selected as the X-Bot, when you add the animation in, you'll get this weird glitch where the arms fold over, So to avoid that from happening, we just want to make sure we have the Xbot selected. And then we can click the download button. And this time we want to download it without the skin, since we don't actually want the character itself, we only want the rig with the animation. Now back in Blender, we can go into the rig.jns tab once again. And then this time in the animation tab, we can select the import Mixamo animation button. Now here we want to select the animation file that we just downloaded from Mixamo. Now you'll notice that the animation isn't binded to our character yet. So in the rig.js tab, we want to click the bind button. And once we do that, it should bind the animation to our character. And now lastly, we need to also bake the animation in. And once again, I'm going to copy the keyframes and then paste them over and over again to extend the animation. And once again, we'll move the keyframes up by 25 frames. And then we'll head into pose mode once again. And then on the first frame, we'll clear the transform properties. And then lastly, we can set a keyframe for that as well. And with that, we've added animation to our character using the rig.js plugin. And you can see how much more efficient this process was than before, where we had to export our character into Mixamo and then import it back into Blender after. So I like to use this plugin because it's a lot faster, and it also allows us to add more animations to one character. And the other benefit is that we also have face bones with this rig. So if we wanted to, we could also animate the face. Now, even with rig.js, we're still limited by the Mixamo library. And although Mixamo is great for when you're starting, you soon realize that it lacks a ton of animations. And if you're looking for ways to add custom animations, then you can either do it manually or use a motion capture suit. Now, there are a ton of different motion capture suits out there, but the most popular one is Rococo. And with this, you can pretty much create any animation you want. Now, unfortunately, I don't have one, so I can't demonstrate how it works. But they have a ton of resources you can check out. The only downside is that it is extremely expensive, costing around 4K. But if you have the budget, then it would be your best option. Now, Rococo also offers a free AI-based solution as well, where all you have to do is upload a video and it will try to replicate the movements from the video to your character. Now, I haven't had a chance to try it out yet, but when I do plan to make a video on it as well. Now, if you wish to animate or pose your character manually, then using the default Daz rig isn't the best option. It's actually much better to use a meta rig, like the one provided by rig.js. The great news is that you don't actually need to install rig.js to be able to use the meta rig on your Daz character. Remember how I mentioned earlier that we have two different ways to import our character from Daz? Well, if we use the easy import option, then we can actually change our rig from Daz to Rigify. So we pretty much get the same rig as the rig.js rig, except now we can add the animations to it. But this is perfect for if you're manually going to animate or pose your character. And now that we've covered how we can add animations to our character, the next step is going to be adding hair. And this process is going to stay the same regardless of what rig you use. So whether you use Mixamo or rig.js or any other rig, the hair process is always going to stay the same. Now, the most important part here is making sure that our character is in A pose before we move on. Now, to start off, I'm going to first hide my rig since it's probably going to get in the way. And now with our model selected, we can go into edit mode. And here we want to make sure we're on face select. Now in the next step, we want to select faces on our character's head. This is going to create the scalp mesh for our character. And if we press C on our keyboard, it will activate the brush tool. We can use the mouse scroll wheel to increase or decrease the size. And then we can start selecting the faces on our character's head. Now to deselect faces, you can use the middle mouse button or hold shift to unselect the faces. Now when using the brush tool, it will lock in your view, so if you want to be able to rotate, you'll have to right click to get rid of the brush tool, and then rotate into the new position and then activate the brush tool once again. It's a bit of a tedious process, but once you get used to it, it becomes a lot faster. And here we want to select half the faces, and the reason we do that is because we'll use the mirror modifier later to then apply it to the other half as well. And this just saves us time since we only have to do half the work. Now when we've selected half the faces, we're going to want to duplicate this mesh by pressing Shift D. Now to separate this mesh into its own object, we can press P and then choose the selection option. So what we essentially did was we duplicated the scalp mesh and then separated it into its own object. And this is what we're going to be using to apply our hair particle system. Now with my scalp mesh selected, I'm going to go into the materials tab and then just delete all the materials applied. This just makes it a bit easier for me to see what my scalp mesh actually looks like. And from here we can go to the modifiers tab. And now we're going to be adding a couple of modifiers here. So the first modifier we're going to add is the mirror modifier. Now inside the mirror modifier, we're going to use the eyedrop tool to select our character as the target object. And then we're also going to move this modifier all the way to the top, so it gets applied before all the other ones. And the next modifier we're going to add is the shrink wrap modifier. And here, once again, we want to select our character as the target object. Now for the snap mode, we want to select above surface, and then we can slowly start to increase the offset value until our scalp mesh is slightly above our character's head. Now the reason we use the shrink wrap modifier is because it will stick our scalp mesh to our character's head. And this makes it a lot easier for us to form our hairline, which we'll do in the next step here. So if we go into edit mode, and then select the vertex and start moving it around, regardless of which direction we move it in, it will always stick to the character's head. And this is the benefit of using the shrink wrap modifier. Now we can select the proportional editing at the top, which will allow us to move multiple vertices at once. Now we can increase or decrease the size of this tool by using the scroll wheel. Now you'll notice that it's a bit hard to see our vertices once we start moving them. To fix that, we can select the on cage option on our shrink wrap modifier. And then from here we can start moving the vertices around to form our hairline shape. Now if your mesh starts to disconnect in the middle, just make sure to select the clipping option on your mirror modifier. And once we're happy with how our hairline looks, we can start to add the hair particle system. We can head into the particle property settings, and then click the add button. Now this will add a particle system, and we want to change it to hair. Now you'll notice that the hair only gets applied to 1/2. So we want to go back into our mirror modifier and then just quickly apply it, and this should fix that problem. Now we can go back into the particle property settings and then reduce the hair length to something much shorter. Now our hair strands are still a little too thick, so we can go into the hair shape tab and then reduce the diameter scale. I usually like to go with 0.003 or 0.002. Now the next thing I want to fix is that we can still see our scalp mesh. So to fix this, we can go uncheck the show emitter both in the render tab and in the viewport display. Now to add some density to our hair, we can go into the children tab and then select the interpolated option. Now I like to set the display amount and the render amount to the same value, and it's usually the full amount that I'll be rendering the animation with, just so I get a better idea what it's actually going to look like when it's rendered out. Now next, let's add a material to our hair. So we can go to the material properties. Now this time, instead of the principal BSDF, we're going to be using the principal hair BSDF shader. This shader is designed for hair, and it gives us a much more realistic look than the regular principal BSDF. Now we won't be able to see what it actually looks like until we're in render mode, and now we can change the color to the color that we want. Now this is just a basic setup for the hair. We still need to style it, and to do that we're going to go into particle edit mode. Here we have a list of tools that we can use to style our hair however we want. Now personally, I only ever use the comb brush, the add brush, and the length brush, and I'll quickly go over how to use these tools in a second here. Now a quick note that as soon as you start editing your hair, you're no longer able to change the emission values here. So just make sure that these are already finalized before you start editing. To start off, we'll select the side part of our hair by either using the box select tool or the brush select tool. Now this may lead to only specific parts of each hair strand being selected. So we can increase our selection by using the select more hotkey. Now this is usually the number pad plus button, but you can double check this by going to preferences and checking where your key binding is set to by default. Now because my keyboard doesn't have a number pad, I've changed my key bindings. So just double check what yours is for the select more hotkey. Now from here we can use the comb brush tool and now start combing our hair down. This is where a split's going to be created for our comb over haircut. Now around the back of the head, we can start to bring the hair down. Now we can press Ctrl-I to select the inverse of our hair particle system. This will select all the hair that wasn't selected before. And once again, we can start using our comb brush to comb our hair into place. Now with this, we should have the rough styling of our hair complete. If we go back into object mode, we can kind of see what our hair is going to look like. Now the next step from here is to use the lengthen brush to change the length in specific areas of the hair. Now around the sides and the back, it should be a lot shorter than the top and the front. So with our lengthen brush selected, if we left click and hold shift, that will shorten our hair for us. And we want to go around the sides and the back, shortening the hair as we go down. Now I'm going to go back into my comb brush and fix the sides once again. Now around the top of the head, I'm going to use the lengthen brush once again, and this time increase the length. And then I'll use the comb brush once again to comb everything back in place. Now I'll pretty much just switch between lengthening the hair, shortening the hair, and then using the comb brush to comb everything back in place. Now this obviously takes a bit of practice and a lot of trial and error, but eventually you'll kind of get used to these brushes and you'll be able to create any hairstyle that you want. Now around the front of the hair, I'm going to select specific hair strands and bring them forward a little bit, just to split up the hair and make it look a bit more natural. And now if we go back into object mode, we can kind of see what our hair looks like once again. And this looks a lot better than what it looked like before. Now I'm going to go back into my particle property settings and increase the strand steps. This will increase the resolution of our hair, making it look a lot more realistic. Now of course you don't want to increase this too much because that'll really increase the geometry in your scene. Now let's go back into render view to get a real idea of what our hair actually looks like. And you can see how realistic our hair is starting to look. Now next let's go over how we can give our character a fade. This is actually a lot easier than you would expect. So the first thing we need to do is we need to select our scalp mesh and then go into the data tab. Here we want to create a new vertex group and name that hair. Now the important thing here is to make sure you have this vertex group selected for the next steps. So now let's go back into the property editor. And here we want to first hide our hair and then also show our emitter. So now with our scalp mesh selected, let's go into weight paint mode. Now essentially in weight paint mode, we're able to apply different weights from 1 to 0 to specific vertex groups. In this case, we have the hair vertex group selected, which was the vertex group that we created earlier. Now let's make sure that our weight is set to 1 and we have the paintbrush selected. And now let's turn on the mirror option as well. And now as we start painting the weights on the scalp, it will apply to both sides. And here the red represents the weight of 1. So essentially all the parts where we want the hair to be longer, we're going to want to paint red. And as we fade the hair out, that's going to be the blue part at the bottom. Now we can also use the blur brush to then smooth out the fade. And once we're done with our weight painting, we can go back into the property editor and unhide our hair and then hide our emitter. Now in the vertex group tab, we can go into the length option and then add in our hair vertex group. This essentially uses our painted weights that go from 1 to 0 to then determine what the hair length should be at different points on our scalp mesh. And this gives us that fade look that we're going for. Now if we want to make changes to our scalp mesh, we can once again hide our hair and then show our emitter. and go back into weight paint mode and then fix the weights that we want to change. Now in this case, I just wanted to bring down the fade a little bit more. Now the next thing I want to go over is some properties we can change that give us a different style of hair. Let's go inside the Children tab, and here we have 4 properties that will change the style of our hair. Now in this case, I'll only go over the clumping value, but when we create the Afro style hair, we'll cover the other properties as well. Now going into the clumping tab, we can change the way our hair clumps around the tips by increasing the value. Now it's a subtle detail, but it does add to the realism of the hair. And with that, we're done creating our first hairstyle. Now next I want to go over a common problem that many of you faced in the past. I've gotten a ton of messages about this specific issue, so I just want to quickly address it. Now if we quickly unhide our rig, and then go into pose mode, and move our character's head, we can see that the hair moves with our character as it should. Now the issue that many of you faced is the hair doesn't move with the character, and the reason for that is the placement of your particle system in the modifier tab. If it's placed before the armature modifier, which is a modifier for the rig, then the hair won't move with your character. So make sure that your hair particle system is applied all the way at the bottom after the armature. Now next we're going to go over how we can do an Afro type hairstyle. So I'm going to hide my first particle system and then add a new one. Now I'm going to reduce the length of the hair to something very small since we're going for an Afro buzz cut. And once again, I'm going to increase the strand steps to add some subdivisions to our hair strands. And to make my hair strands thinner, I'll also change my diameter scale. And next we can add some children to our hair, and then I'll set the display amount to the same as the render amount. And you'll notice that these steps are pretty much the exact same things that we did when we were doing our comb over hairstyle. The main difference here is now we need to change our kink type to curl. And you'll notice that this gives us a huge ball of hair. Now, as we reduce the amplitude, our hair will start to go back to normal. Now, I usually like to set the amplitude to 0.001. And then we can increase the frequency, and you'll notice that the hair starts to coil. And this is pretty much the foundation of creating Afro hairstyles in Blender. Now, next we want to go into the roughness tab and start to increase the random value. And then we also want to reduce the size value as well. Now, doing this is really important because it gives our hair a bit more scatterness, and I find that this looks a lot more realistic than when it's just curly. But of course, you're going to want to play around with these parameters on your own until you get the hairstyle that you're looking for. And here, once again, I reduced the hair length to something much shorter to match the buzz cut that I'm going for. Now, the random value also has an effect on how long the hair looks. So if I start to decrease the random value, you'll notice that the hair starts to get shorter as well. Now we can also go into render view to get a better idea of how our hair actually looks. And once again, we can also add a fade to this hairstyle as well by simply adding the vertex group that we created earlier with the weight painting on it. Now we can also easily turn this into a full-blown afro by increasing the hair length. And then from here we can go into particle edit mode and then adjust the styling by using the various brushes that we went over earlier. And with that, we've pretty much covered all the basics of creating hairstyles for our characters in Blender. Now, creating facial hair is pretty much the exact same process. So I first selected a couple of faces, and then I duplicated them and then separated them into their own mesh. From there, I once again added a mirror modifier and selected my character as the mirror object. And once again, I moved the mirror modifier all the way to the top so it's applied before all the other modifiers. Then I added the shrink wrap modifier and selected my character as a target object. And like I did with the scalp mesh, I deleted all the materials just to make it a bit easier to see the mesh. And then I went into edit mode and started to extrude the edges to create my beard shape. Now this is going to depend on the type of beard that you're going for, so you'll have to shape it accordingly. And this does take a bit of time, but it's pretty much just extruding faces and then moving them into place. And because of the shrink wrap modifier, the mesh should stick to the face. Now recently Kanye's been rocking a full beard, so that's a style that I went for. And once my scalp mesh was finished, I added a hair particle system and pretty much went through the same steps as when we were adding hair to our character earlier. And then I went into particle edit mode and started editing the beard shape until I got it to look as close as possible to his beard in real life. I also duplicated one of the faces to create some patches on his beard. And once I was happy with the beard, it was time to add in the clothing. Now next let's go over how we can add an outfit to our character. Now for this I like to use Marvel's Designer. It's pretty much the go-to software for adding clothing and simulating them with an animation, and I would highly recommend using it as well. It costs $40 a month, but they do offer a 30-day free trial. I have a full crash course on Marvel's Designer as well, which I'll have linked for you guys in the description below. Now before opening up Marvel's Designer, we need to export our character into two different formats. We need an FBX format and an Limbic format. Now the reason for using two different formats is because the FBX format is the live version without the animation attached to it. This is great for when we're creating the outfit. I find that I would run into a lot of issues when I just use the Limbic format for both, since that file tends to be extremely heavy. So to summarize, we'll use the FBX format for creating the clothing, and then we'll import our Limbic version when we're ready to simulate it with the animation. Also, a quick note, we want to make sure that our character is in A pose on the initial frame when we're exporting it. This is very important because it makes it a lot easier to create outfits when our character is in A pose. So first, let's go ahead and export our character as an FBX file. Now in Marvel's Designer, we can import our character. And for the import settings here, you want to make sure you have the same scale set as me. So it should be in centimeters. And with that, we should have our model in Marvel's Designer. Now, like I mentioned before, I have a full crash course on Marvel's Designer you can watch. So in this crash course, I'm just going to go over my workflow for adding an outfit and then simulating it with an animation. I'm going to create an outfit using my digital fashion starter kit that you can download off my website. This has a set of pre-made templates that I've made that are super easy to use. You can simply just drag and drop these outfits on your character. And with these templates, I was able to make an outfit in less than a minute. And the great thing about these templates is that you can easily adjust them to your liking. Now I went for a leather-inspired outfit that Kanye was wearing during his Vulture's release party. For this, all I had to do was change the material to leather, and then change the fit as well to match his body type. And from here, I just want to quickly go into the UV editor and just make sure that everything is in a 1x1 square and nothing is overlapping. And once again, I've already explained all of this in my Marvel's Designer crash course. Next, it's time to simulate our clothing with an animation. The first thing we need to do is we need to go back into Blender and once again export our character, but this time we'll be exporting the Limbic version. Now here you want to make sure you have the selected objects checked, and we want to uncheck the export hair and export particles options, since the hair particle system will make the file size even larger. Now the exporting process may take some time since it's a pretty large file. And now we can import our Limbic file into Marvel's Designer. And here you want to just make sure you have the exact same settings as me. Now, because our animation starts off with an A pose in the beginning, our Alembic file should perfectly replace the FBX file. And now if you also look at the timeline, you'll notice that our character object has an animation baked into it, which is represented by this purple bar. Now here, I also like to change my play type to real time. And I want to make sure that my simulation quality is set to stable, with the fitting option selected. This tends to give me the most accurate and stable simulation. And from here, I can press the red simulate button, and this will go frame by frame and then bake in the animation. And here now you can also see why we wanted that 25 frame gap between the A pose and the walk animation. It essentially gives the clothes enough time to smoothly transition between the two poses. And once our baking is done, we can play back the animation to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And then from here, we can export our outfit as an Alembic file. This will ensure that our clothing has the animation attached to it once we import it back in Blender. Now for the export settings, we want to make sure we have the thick option selected. And then for the image size, we want to ideally set it to around 4K to get a better quality result. Now this file size tends to be pretty large, so it may take some time exporting it. So just wait it out and then join me in Blender once you're done. Now we can import our outfit by going into File, Import, and then selecting the Alembic option. Now once we have the file selected, we just want to make sure that we change the scale to 0.01, otherwise our outfit will be way too large. And once it's imported, our outfit should fit perfectly on our character. Now we can also quickly test to make sure that the animation works as expected. Now let's go into the shading editor, and by default our clothing won't have any materials applied. So let's add a new material, and now we want to import those texture maps that we exported from Marvelous Designer. So first we want to go into Preferences, and then we want to make sure we have the Node Wrangler add-on installed. And now with the Principled BSDF selected, we can press Ctrl Shift and T, and this will open up our directory. And here we want to select all the texture maps for our outfit. And this should connect all the nodes in the right spots. Now next we can also add shoes to our character, and I've covered this process in my Marvelous Designer crash course. Now the best approach here is to get models online, since modeling shoes yourself can be a pretty tedious process. You can find a ton of models on CG Trader or TurboSquid. And once I have the shoes added and I parent them to the rig, the shoes will then move with their animation. Now from here we can unhide our outfit. Now as we play the animation, you'll notice that the pants start to overlap with the shoes. And this is why I prefer to add in my shoes before I simulate my outfit in Marvelous Designer. So to fix this issue, I'm going to select my character and my shoes and export it as an Alembic file once again. Then in Marvelous Designer, I can import this new Alembic file. And here we can start to fix the overlapping issue by moving the pants so that they fit properly over the shoes. And with that fixed, we can now simulate once again. And once the simulation is complete, we can play back our animation to make sure that everything works as expected. Now let's export our outfit once again. Now back in Blender, we can delete our original outfit and then add in our new one. And once again, we can go into the shading editor and then reapply our texture maps. And with that, we've pretty much covered everything we need to know on how to create custom 3D characters. Now in the last part of this crash course, I'm going to go over my process for creating a simple scene. And of course, you have the creative freedom to build out your scene however you want. I start off by adding a plane, which would act as a ground in my scene. I also changed the color to black and then reduced the roughness a little bit to make it a bit more reflective. Next, I added a camera into my scene and then positioned it to the side of my character. I also changed the focal length of the camera to around 15mm to give it a more stylized feel. Next, I decided to change the background for my scene. In the world property settings, I changed the background color to black, and then added a couple of lights to light up my scene. First, I added a light that shined directly from the top, then I added one to the back, and then one at the front at an angle. In the end, I was able to get some nice cinematic lighting that I was super happy with. Now at this point when I played the animation, my character walks in the same spot. To fix this, I added an empty object and then parented my character, the clothes, the lights, and the camera to it. Now if I move my empty object, it will move all those objects as well. And then we can add a keyframe on the initial frame, which in my case is the 25th frame, since that's when the walk animation starts. And then I can move to the last frame, and then move my character by a couple of meters and add a keyframe there as well. Now if I right click on my timeline, I can change the interpolation to linear. This will ensure that my character moves at a constant speed. Now if I press play, my character will move forward, with the lights and the camera following him as well. Now next I can go to the output properties, and then set my directory for my animation. Here I also want to change the file format to FFmpeg, and then change the encoding container to MPEG-4. Now lastly I want to set my start animation value to 25, since that's when the walk animation starts. And with that we have everything set up, so we're ready to render our final animation. And that is it for this crash course. I really hope you enjoyed it. And once again, you can download all my character models from my 3D character kit. They're fully rigged models, so you can pose them or animate them however you want in any of your animations. And I'll also be adding in new models over time, and so once you buy it once, you'll have lifetime access. I think you'll find it very valuable, and it will be a great way to support the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.